Okay, but I'm really here to introduce Martin Empson, who's going to speak on Marxism, Nature and Society. Martin's written a number of books, Land and Labour, and we've got a pamphlet as well, which will be on sale at the back for people later on. Martin's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and we will have plenty of time for questions and discussions afterwards, okay? And then I will let you know how we're going to run the meeting after he's spoken. Okay, I'll hand you over to Martin.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. I'm not going to talk tonight. It's always good to start off with what you're not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about today in any great detail the enormous environmental crises that we face as humanity. The crisis of biodiversity, ocean acidification, climate change, so on, and so on. I'm not going to talk in any detail about them. Rather, what I'm going to try and explore today, with the hope of trying to clarify how we can build a society that's more sustainable, what I'm going to talk about today is capitalism's peculiar relationship with nature and how we got here. And that, I think, will illuminate both why capitalism is so destructive to the natural world, why it's so unsustainable, and also whether or not we can actually live in a sustainable world. Karl Marx, very famously, a quote I've often used, described the peculiarity of capitalism and its relationship with nature. He writes this, that under capitalism, for the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility. It ceases to be recognised as a power for itself. The theoretical discoveries of its laws appear merely as a ruse to subjugate it under human need, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. That's a very incisive analysis of what capitalism and how it sees nature. Capitalism sees nature, both human nature and non-human nature, merely in terms of its role in the making of profit. And in particular, and I'll discuss this a little bit in a moment, it turns nature quite consciously into a commodity that can be bought, sold, priced, and so on. And I think this is in part one of the reasons that capitalism finds it very difficult to deal with the question of climate change. It can only conceive of environmental solutions coming through financial mechanisms or trading schemes or things that really focus on the actual commodification of nature, not on dealing with that. The other problem is that capitalism is a system that's based on the accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation. It's a system based on the manufacture of profits, and that is one of the real reasons that we face environmental crisis. Now, I highlight this way of looking at nature and how Marx highlights it because it's not a universally accepted way of analysing the historical way that humans have related to the natural world. It's very often, actually, if you do talk to people, they do really say, oh, capitalism turns everything into something to make money, or they say, well, they give trees value or fish value or whatever. But actually, in terms of our historical relationship with nature, this isn't the way that things have normally been conceived. And I think in particular, even very good authors can misunderstand the historically changing relationship that we've had with the natural world. They see it as a constant rather than something that's varied through time. So back in 2014, the environmental activist George Monbiot, Guardian columnist, often writes some very, very good stuff. He writes this: "The Anthropocene, now a popular term amongst scientists, is the epoch in which we live, one dominated by human impact on the living world. Most date it from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but it might have begun much earlier, with a killing spree that commenced 2 million years ago. What rose onto its hind legs on the African savannas was from the outset death, the destroyer of worlds." So Monbiot sees humanity and the presence of humans is essentially a negative one when it comes to nature. He continues, "Almost everywhere we went, humankind erased a world of wonders, changing the way the biosphere functions." Now, Monbiot is right. Everywhere humans did go, they did change the biosphere, alter it, and so on. I would disagree, however, that there's an innate destructiveness to human nature that means that nature is systematically destroyed or that there is an inevitable environmental crisis as a result of humanity. I want to argue that a Marxist approach to the human-nature relationships offers an understanding that's actually backed up by archaeological and anthropological evidence that shows that nature and how we've related to it and that relationship has changed systematically over time. Depending on what sort of society you've lived on, you've had a different relationship in the past to the natural world. It's not a constant relationship, and it also illuminates the fact that for most of humanity's history, we did live in a sustainable relationship with nature, and thus I think we could do so in the future. The unsustainable fossil fuel capitalism that we live in today is not the result of some innate human greed or an innate desire to destroy worlds, but because of a historical specific set of circumstances and class struggle. So let's begin by looking at how Marx does approach the question of nature. He starts really from the question of how we labour upon the natural world, that we have always shaped the natural world and changed it. We've always altered it in very often small ways, but we've had that impact upon nature. We cut down trees, we ploughed fields, dammed rivers, fished, and so on. And he contrasts this with the fact that we also know that animals do the same. Beavers build dams or chop down trees or cut, they do things that make trees fall over, don't they? I'm not very good on the animal things here, am I, today? And Marx, I'm strong on the Marx, so let's say what Marx says. Marx famously points this out, doesn't he? He says, what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is the architect builds a cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. So humans, for Marx, have an intellectual ability to plan a relationship with nature, to shape it, that relationship, that manage that relationship in their in the interest of satisfying their own need, the conscious management of the metabolic interaction with nature, as Marx writes. And we see this in the archaeological record in very, very detailed ways. Even very, very long ago, in Land and Labour, I give an example of the South African savannas where we know that hunter-gatherer tribes, as long as 75 to 55,000 years ago, consciously went and burnt particular areas of land because they knew by burning off the land one year, they could return the following year, and the food and the crops that produced the foods that they wanted to eat would be much bigger than they would have been if they hadn't burnt the land back. So a conscious recognition that if we do this today, next year we will have more food, a conscious management of the landscape, even in a hunter-gatherer society 70-odd thousand years before the present. Humans do this transformation. They do it obviously through using their labour. And labour for Marx is the appropriation of nature for the satisfaction of human need. He continues, labour is first of all a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates and controls a metabolism between himself and nature. He confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own need. And through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way simultaneously changes his own nature. So Marx is saying there that we don't just act on nature. Because we are part of nature, we depend upon the natural world, but we are also out of nature. We have evolved out of that natural world. Any interaction we have with the natural world in turn changes us and alters alters ourselves. And this is why it is correct to suggest and to show that historically humans had an impact on the environment, and they also had sometimes an impact on the environment that was negative in terms of their own societies. They could undermine the viability of their own societies through their changes to the natural world. And we know dozens of examples of history where sometimes humans have done things to their environment, which has meant that their own societies have faced collapse or have had to change or have had to adapt. And again, in the book I've written about some of them. The example I like the most is the example of the Clovis culture of North America at the end of the last ice age. They depended very much on the hunting of megafauna, big animals, horses, mammoths, things like that. And we know that they did this because we often find their flint heads stuck in the bones of extinct animals. And at a time of changing climate, we know that the Clovis hunters probably helped to undermine the viability of populations enough that those populations went extinct, thus threatening their existence of hunter-gatherers. I emphasise this because I think it's very important that even if the Clovis hunters had exterminated all the animals on their own, it would have been a very localised environmental crisis. It's not a global one. It wouldn't have impacted hunter-gatherers living in Africa or Europe or Asia or anywhere else. And that must be contrasted very much with the way capitalism, with its much more extended and stronger mode of production, can have a global impact as a result of what we do to the environment and so on. Now, alongside this smaller impact upon the environment as a result of the lower of the earlier modes of production. There are also associated very different ways of approaching the natural world and thus approaching each other. Hunter-gatherers, for instance, would relate to nature differently to how feudal peasants would relate to the natural world, who would in turn relate differently to how we as humans living in modern-day 21st century capitalism might do that. And there's all sorts of anthropological evidence that shows how we have conceived nature differently. We've understood nature. We've had a different relationship with nature, and how this is. And I'll come on to how this has changed. Let's look at one example from the American environmental historian William Cronin, who wrote about some of the Native Americans in New England. He writes this: families enjoyed exclusive use of their planted fields and of the labour. Sorry, I'll start that again. Families enjoyed exclusive use of their planted fields and of the land on which their wigwams stood, and so might be said to have owned them. But neither of them were permanent possessions. Wigwams were moved every few months, and planting fields were abandoned after a number of years. No effort was made to set permanent boundaries. What families possessed in their fields was the use of them. So here again is a different perception of nature by a group of people who, when you read the accounts of the interactions between European explorers and Native American communities, actually the concept of owning land, of being able to parcel up land, is completely alien to the Native Americans because of the way their existence depends on a different relationship and creates a different relationship to the natural world. And that's hunter-gatherer societies. It's also true to a lesser extent of later societies. Feudal peasants, who I mentioned earlier, often are very reliant on a much more collective and communal use of the land and ownership of the land. I mean, obviously you have the feudal lords at the top of society and the mass of the peasantry, but one of the things that often characterises peasant societies is an attempt to collectively decide as a village group which land is used by whom. You get the strip farming, so that fields are split up into strips and people farm different things. Now, the reason for this is to make sure that no one person has all the worst land or the most fertile land, that actually the communities can share this. And for capitalism to develop fully, and for capitalism to be able to do what it wants to do in terms of making profits and so on, all these historical approaches to nature, to land, to the landscape even, and also to each other have to be shattered and broken. They were a threat to private property. I mentioned how this can sometimes be seen very clearly with the arrival of European settlers in North America. The Marxist anthropologist Eleanor Burke-Leacock wrote a book called Myths of Male Dominance, and one of the things she looks at is how the Jesuit missionaries who arrived with the French fur traders in northeastern Canada in the 17th century had their lives completely transformed by the ideological impact of that arrival, but most importantly by the transformation that took place to their economic lives, but through the needs of the European fur trade. The French fur traders needed thousands and thousands and thousands of pelts of animals, and the Montagneux people, who were a hunter-gatherer community who'd lived a much more communal, collective existence, collectively deciding where they hunted, how they hunted, where their village would camp, and so on, found that under the pressure of the demands of the French settlers and colonists and traders, their entire economic basis for society was breaking down. So instead of taking a few pelts that they caught on a hunt to the French trading post, the French traders said, bring us more, we'll give you these lovely knives, these lovely bits of clothing, this wonderful food. And over time, over less than a decade, those people found that their relationship to nature was now through a process of owning small parcels of land where there would be individual traps. So instead of the collective hunt, there was now the individual ownership of areas of land where they could catch the animals and exchange them. And that led to all sorts of other changes. The matrilocal society of the Montagneux broke down as the Jesuit missionaries said it's wrong that the woman is equal in the relationship with the man, that you collectively look after your children and so on. And so the impact of the needs of the French traders utterly smashes and breaks that collective relationship that society had. Similarly, this happens everywhere else. It's not just this very localised example. I've recently read a lovely book by a man called John F. Richards called The Commodification of Animals, and he talks about how this happens in all sorts of scenarios around the world as capitalism extends outwards from Europe into other areas. And he talks about the Creeks, a Native American tribe, who again survived by hunting animals on the plains and encountered European fur traders who had their insatiable demand for fur, as European fur traders always do. And he writes this: although the Creeks adapted quickly and successfully to the new incentives of the deerskin trade, they faced a basic contradiction. Economic and political forces made it imperative that they delivered a maximal number of deerskins every year. They became market hunters linked to a world market who now used muskets to avidly pursue as many deer and bear as possible. Now, we shouldn't over-romanticise the pre-capitalist modes of production. You know, the Creeks, I mean, John F. Richards points out in his book that the Creeks they went a society that was beautifully and harmoniously living with nature and caring for it, and you know, sometimes we see Native Americans as portrayed. They were quite prone to hunting more animals than they needed because there were such vast numbers of buffalo or deer that they could kill as many as they wanted, and then everybody could have the choicest cut of meat or the best pelt or whatever. But you know, that didn't systematically undermine the viability of those herds, and he contrasts it absolutely with this almost mechanized slaughter and systematic killing of buffalo and deer that takes place to satisfy the needs of capitalism. He says, Richard says, once Indians were touched by the stimulus of market demand, any restraints they'd previously maintained eroded rapidly. Pursuit of the material rewards offered by the fur trade forced Indians to hunt preferred species steadily, despite declining numbers. What they became were commercial hunters caught up in an all-consuming market. And this is echoed, I think, by Marx. When Marx talks about what capitalism does as it develops, there's a wonderful passage, I'm sure comrades have heard it or maybe read it in Das Kapital, where he talks about what capitalism does when it arrives in America and what it does to people and planet. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. It signalises the rosy dawn of capitalist production. Capital, Marx goes on to say, enters the world dripping from head to foot, from every pore with blood and dirt. And that's because it's turning nature and people into and subordinating them to the needs of the system that is about making profit. So for Marx, the transformation of social relations and the transformation of the humanity's relation to nature is part and parcel of the development of capitalism, either when capitalism is encountered and destroyed by European settlers, or as it develops out of pre-existing modes of production. And the classic example of this, of course, is how in Britain, in England in particular, we see the development of feudalism to capitalism. Now, if you read the textbooks, this involves a civil war and the beheading of Charles I, and you know, the Roundheads and Cromwell and all that exciting stuff, and that's very, very much true. But there's also an underlying process going on in society in the 17th century that means that the bourgeoisie that were developing had to fight for their interests to become precedent in a new order. They had to behead the king for capitalism to develop, and that underlying process is the development of capitalist relations in the economy, the development of trade, development of buying and selling, the development of wage labour, and so on. But it also, crucially for the point of this talk, involves the systematic transformation of people's relationship to the land, the destruction of the old peasant class and the enclosure of land, the scrapping of common lands, the displacement of people from the countryside into urban settings, and so on. It's a vicious process, and you know we know, of course, of the viciousness of what capitalism did in North America. But we shouldn't forget that there was a similar vicious process taking place over a period of hundreds of years in England and Europe as capitalism develops and lives are destroyed and uprooted and so on. And it's quite a startlingly quick process sometimes, though the process is elongated. So in the year 1600, 25% of people living in the countryside were wage labourers. 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution, as Duncan Howells used to say, neither glorious nor a revolution, there were 56. So that figure had almost doubled in that brief period of time as the sort of concentration and development of capitalism in that period. And that required the destruction and the breaking of all sorts of traditions, of customs, of rights, of laws that the peasantry had about how they owned and used and controlled land, not just in England, in Europe as well. One of the famous things that Marx first writes about, the famous class struggles he's involved in, is about the right of peasants to collect fallen wood from forests and so on. But here in England, there had to be a systematic destruction of those rights. Parliament enacts hundreds and hundreds of laws in the 16th, 17th and 18th century to legalise the enclosure of land, the destruction of common land, to prevent things like poaching and so on taking place. E.P. Thompson writes that this was needed, such legislation was needed because property was not, in 1700, trenched round on every side by capital statutes. What he means is that there was no protection yet for the new system of private property, and that had to be imposed and created and set upon society, and that simultaneously meant breaking up the old ways of doing stuff. Poaching is very interesting because to us, poaching is now something you might, I don't know, people do in the countryside. You know, you go and hunt something you're not supposed to. But actually, for hundreds and hundreds of years under feudalism, poaching was the way poor peasants in society could supplement their meagre incomes and their food. You know, you can catch a rabbit or a bird or whatever and eat it, even if you're not really supposed to. But it becomes with the development of capitalism, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws are enacted to prevent this sort of thing. The 1723 Black Act made it made it possible to behead peasants for killing deer on the king's land and so on. Why? Because actually now, if you own private land, if you're now saying what is the most important thing about society is the private ownership of this land, then also what's associated with that is the private ownership of anything on that land, the birds that nest on it and fly over it, the hares and rabbits that run around on it. And you have to drum in the importance and the precedence of private property. You have to drum that into the peasantry's head, so you kill them or you transport them if they break these laws. Now, what develops, of course, with capitalism is that system that I meant, that quote from Marx right at the beginning of the talk, that under this society, nature then becomes an object of consumption, a means of production, part of the productive process, something to make money out of, not something for people who are hungry to use, not something for people who've got no land to farm, and so on. I should say as well that this is not an automatic process. It's absolutely contested. The peasants fight like hell to retain their common land. They throw down the fences and hedges that have enclosed their territories. They beat up the farmers. They sometimes go to court to fight against the parliamentary enclosure laws and so on. By and large, they're defeated. They're defeated because the forces of the state are against them. Though it is possible in many places in England to go to common land that we still have as a result of successful struggles by people in the past. But by and large, what comes at the end of the 17th century is a capitalist society, with that peculiar relationship to nature. Now, Marx examines this, and he looks at what's happened, and this is where the notion of the potential for a sustainable society comes, because Marx looks at the development of capitalism and what it does to the planet, if you like, particularly through the question of agriculture. And he contrasts the development of capitalist agriculture with a more sustainable way of farming and producing food in the past. He writes that all progress in capitalist agriculture is progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more lasting sources of that fertility. And he writes that the process of primitive accumulation, of pushing the peasants off the land and all that stuff I've talked about, conquers the field for capitalist agriculture, incorporating the soil into capital and creating for urban industries the necessary supplies of free and rightless proletarians. The end result, as I said, was the development of capitalism, was that the producers have been separated off from the original sources of wealth, principally the soil, and we're now working as alienated labour as part of the capitalist system, alienated from the natural world, from each other, and the process of production. And this is really, if people have read John Bellamy Foster's work or some of the stuff in Marxism ecology and so on, this is the origin, if you like, of that metabolic rift under capitalism, that separation, that break, if you like, between human society and its relationship, its sustainable historical relationship with the natural world. Capitalism had created an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. Marx continues, and Marx says that despite all its technology and science, capitalism can't solve that rift. And he writes particularly about the way capitalist agriculture systematically degrades and ruins the soil's fertility. And he understands that it's possible to use science to develop fertilizers that could re-improve the soil. But he understands this is a sort of external process, the re-fertilization of the soil. It's not about the sort of organic, natural, systematic relationship between humans and nature. And he says that he makes the point that capitalism can't solve that environment. It can patch things up, but there's a long-term unsustainable relationship that's going to come about. And if you want to have a rational agriculture, if you want to have an agriculture that doesn't systematically destroy and defertilize the soil, then you actually have to get rid of capitalism and so on. There's one further development, I've only got a few minutes left, one further development which I think is crucial to understanding why capitalism is so unsustainable, and that's the fact that in the 18th century or so, rather contrary to what the capitalists would have liked to have done, they have to adopt fossil fuels as the main fuel for driving force. I haven't got time to go into the detail of this. I direct people to Andreas Malm's wonderful book, Fossil Capital, which is on sale at the back of the room, which explores why it is that the capitalists adopted fossil fuels, not because they were cheap. Actually, it required quite a lot, because actually it allowed them to exploit labour in cities in a way that was much more systematic than they could do relying on water power in the countryside and so on. Andreas Malm says it gave the capitalists a ticket to the town, which I think is a lovely thing. And once British capitalism had adopted fossil fuels, everywhere else did it. It's a classic example of combined and uneven development. The capitalists in America and Asia and the rest of it didn't have to go through the process of inventing water wheels and the rest of it. They could jump straight to fossil fuels, and fossil fuels become central, embedded in capitalism, absolutely at the heart of the system, which helps to lead to the origins of the peculiarly unsustainable world that we live in today. I suppose the final point really is to say that now that we've got to this unsustainable world, now that we recognise that we live in a system that can only degrade and destroy the natural world in the interest of making profit, or see it as a way of dumping the waste out of the productive process, can we have a different way of organising things? Well, I think firstly, having shown that historic societies have been sustainable in how they related to nature, that there isn't anything innate about human nature that means we simply destroy the world in the interests of our society, I think we can push that question to one side. So it's not about human nature that we're destroyed. We can recognise that actually it's the product of a process of development of capitalism that has required the destruction and the breaking of things of the mass of the population, the shaping of society in the interests of the capitalists and the production process, and we have to end that. I think that it is entirely possible to conceive of a system that is much more sustainable, based on a democratic planning of production that allows us as a society to say this is what we need, and this is why we need it, and this is what its impact will be. So let's discuss whether that's good or bad, and that will require a revolutionary transformation of society. The fossil fuel corporations, big business, the governments that rule in their name, they're not going to relinquish power and allow us to do that automatically. We will have to fight and break their power, not just as individual companies and so on, but as a system. But we will also have to do that as well to change ourselves. There's a very famous quote from Marx about why revolution is necessary. I'm sure comrades have heard the famous phrase about throwing off the muck of ages, but listen to the slightly longer quote. Marx explains here why revolution is necessary. It's both for the production on a mass scale of communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself. The alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but because also the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. And I think that notion of the creation of communist consciousness is very important in terms of our understanding of nature, because it is about putting ourselves back at the heart of where we historically have been as part of nature, labouring and changing the world around us in a collective interest of ordinary people and of the wider natural world, rather than as existing as an atomised individual relating to nature through an alienated labour process. The fact that we have lived in a sustainable way in the past with society, I think, think gives us hope that with the development of technology and science that we have today, that we can use those productive forces in a way that's of the benefit for everybody and for society, not just for the precious few. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Susan Clark from the Glasgow branch, and I'm passionate about our wildflower meadows because they're a very important habitat for our wildlife, and they've been decreasing rapidly through intensive farming, but particularly through neonicotines. If you saw that programme on Countryfile, all about it, and they've left fields bare like a desert, all these insecticides from the 1940s onwards, and we just need a ban on them. But it doesn't sit well with farmers either. It's not their fault. The likes of Bayer, the insecticide companies, have wall-to-wall advertising for neonicotines, killing our wildflowers, because they get in the way of a high yield of wheat, oats, etc. And what is a good idea I learned from Countryfile is they've been planting wildflower borders around their fields, because there's about a 25% reduction in our bee populations, and we need to offset that with wildflower borders in the fields. And if there's a way to get rid of neonicotines without damaging farmers, we'll have to work with farmers on the subject, because there's been an 80% reduction in our starling population since the 1970s. And I just worry about our wildflowers. There's been about 8 going extinct, 8 endangered, and lots are going that way. If we don't do something now, a countryside walk would just not be the same with our children, showing them our wildflowers, wildlife and the birds and butterflies. It's a great experience. But I think it's a very important issue, environmentalism, because we're just doing an awful lot of damage to our planet, which we could reduce. But thanks for listening.
Just before you speak, the person from over here had their hand up. Yeah. You come up as well.
I'm Jeremy. I'm from the West Country, and there's quite a lot of tension in strategy terms between sort of revolutionary socialists who talk about internationalism, talk about destroying capitalism, and what I would sort of talk about is the wider kindred spirits of the Green movement, and in particular those who are saying that the urgency of the problem means that they need to begin to tackle it now, and we have places like Transitions Totnes and the Transitions movement, which is coming out of that, which tries to put people more in contact with a sustainable lifestyle at the moment. And they say, look, we're doing things on the ground, we're creating this amount of space. And I almost see this in terms of an approach which perhaps has parallels perhaps with the cooperative movement, because we view the cooperative movement and say, well, look, it exists within capitalism. The co-op shops and things have to trade, and those, and we've seen the collapse of the co-op bank and all the rest of it. These little eruptions of space, nevertheless, it exists, and surely because come the glorious day of the revolution, there's going to have to be antecedents, examples where the working class, when people take control, are going to be able to make reference back to say this is how it could be done, and all the rest of it. So there's always a bit of a tension, I think, between those kindred spirits who perhaps want to go off and create their own communities, but nevertheless are going to be subject to all the capitalist laws, the planning regulations, the controls which exist there. But nevertheless, they're showing how they can create some little sort of bubbles of space which erupt, and how you support those bubbles without losing the wider picture. And that's quite a tension that we grapple with, and I'm sure lots of other people do. And I wouldn't mind a comment from Martin on that. Thank you.
And do you want to come up as well? So we have two up at a time. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to raise the issue of, obviously, as socialists, we're going to fight the capitalist system. But I always feel that we underplay, actually, we've got to fight the injustices and inequalities of capitalism, but there's quite a few injustices and inequalities left over from the feudalist system, and particularly land ownership. I think we should address more. There's some bloke got dug up from a car park in Leicester a year or so back, and he's the descendants of his cousins, the Plantagenets, apparently own still 1 million acres in this land. That's covered in Kevin Cahill's book, who owns the land of Britain and Ireland. And I just think, that landowner has got billions in subsidies from the European grants, and it's subsidies that they got not for actual economic production, agricultural production. It's just the ownership of the area of land. The royal family, it's not covered how much land they're increasing their land holdings all the time through the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster. We should be we need to have a go at these Norman gangster parasites who was at the 950th anniversary of their arrival, which was just last October there, and I think there should be more attack on the royals and all the rest of the landowning parasites.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm with International Socialists in Toronto, Canada. It's great to meet you, Martin. I've plagiarized from your book many times. And I wanted to pick up on some of the things you said about capitalism's links with fossil fuel, total reliance on fossil fuels, and the role that Indigenous people have played. And of course, in Canada, it's a very live issue. The Canadian state was founded on the exploitation, dispossession, and total colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada, whether they were First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And in the climate justice movement today, things have kind of come around to bite capitalism with the development of tar sands oil in Alberta. Is the major source of carbon emissions in Canada, and there's a desire, of course, to build pipelines, more and more pipelines, to be able to export that oil around the world. And in the leadership of the fight, in fact, are the Indigenous peoples, and it's a pleasure to have them, and important to have them leading from their spiritual point of view and from their the role they play in relationship to the land for all the reasons that Martin mentioned. How many people here have heard about the Leap Manifesto? It's a really important document to look up. So I'm sure you've heard Naomi Klein's name. And her partner, Avi Lewis, helped instigate something called the Leap Manifesto, which was written 3 years ago. And some of our comrades were involved in its writing as well. And it was the first time, it's not a revolutionary document, but it was the first time that 4 different groups came together to agree on the way forward in terms of climate justice. It pulled together many, many Indigenous activists, pulled together labor leaders, environmental activists, and as well as very social justice groups, and put together this manifesto that said all 4 of those things need to be addressed in a big way. And since then, Avi Lewis has gone on to push for labor unions to support the manifesto, for communities to take it up. Some places they want to run city councils, municipal councils that will be based on the Leap Manifesto. So I'd urge you to take a look at it as a possible model, and certainly an interesting way in Canada to pull together very diverse groups who traditionally had not worked together before. Thank you.
Hi, so my name's Ian, and I'm a conservation ecologist. So this is all kind of really good stuff for me. The issue that Martin raised about the stance of people like Monbiot, the sense that we are inherently destructive, is a very common feature actually within certain areas of the environment movement. And as a conservation ecologist, I probably just want to give you some ammunition to respond. If you look at modern day conservation, what we are mainly preoccupied with is the replication of historic land use. Hay meadows is a really good example, so it's already been brought up. The area of hay meadow in the UK has dropped by 97% since the end of the war. And the reason for that is that hay went from being one of the most important assets on the farm under feudalism and early capitalism, because that was what fed the horses, and the horse was the engine of the farm. Well, after the war, in particular with the Marshall Plan and a whole lot of other things, you saw much higher levels of industrialization, and automatically hay meadows became worthless. And not just worthless, but actually in the way of production. So you've seen a shift since the war from hay to silage, intensive silage, monocultural crops. So instead of these fields full of wonderful biodiversity that actually were beneficial to the livestock because they were also full of nutrient diversity, you now have this bizarre situation where modern day capitalist industrial farms will feed their stock out on the fields for a bit, then put them in a barn over winter and stuff them full of silage. And then because the silage is such a low nutrient level, they also have to then inject them with all the other things like antibiotics and everything else. So it shows the irrationality of the system, but the end product for capitalism is higher profit per unit, per labour unit and everything else. And conservationists, what we're doing, we've got little pockets left and we're trying to look after it. And if you watch what we're doing, we're even out there scything sometimes, which is quite bizarre in this modern day, but that's replicating that particular method. And the important lesson from that is that human beings have been a positive force for biodiversity. If you look at where biodiversity peaks historically and geographically, it's where human beings are actually interacting with life, with nature itself. Because what humans do is they create a very unsettled system, which is beneficial to high levels of biodiversity, because it needs that ecological dynamism in order to flourish. So the good news is we are beneficial for biodiversity and have been historically, and all we have to do is jettison this dreadful system and go on to some nice eco-socialist system where we can actually repair the damage that's been done.
This is a point I'd like to hear your viewpoint as well. I agree with all the points made about, but even after this consciousness shift towards viewing nature as a living entity, which it is, and in a socialist state, but is it still worth mentioning, animal agriculture? Will that change? Because we're not going to return to, as you mentioned before, hunter-gatherers in a sustainable way. We're still going to be, farming these animals in an unsustainable way, which is due to the leading deforestation, leading species extinction and leading dead zones. And it's a point that, you could argue that won't be addressed. And is it a separate issue that, we'd have to abolish it altogether? Yeah.
Hi, I just want to emphasise one of Martin's last points and why it's absolutely vital we change society through revolution. Because if you look at other ways that people propose to change society, it's normally through reform, or capitalists argue that the free market will react to people's opinions. And of course, if you're trying to reform society through the state is really controlled by the media and different capitalists, and who will basically try and get profit. And if you're trying to look at people changing how the market works and the market reacting to people's opinions aren't going to change, because again, their opinions under capitalism are dictated by the media, and the media is owned by people who want profit. And at the minute, they've got the infrastructure to be able to use fossil fuels and, start destroying the planet and have all these problems which we've discussed already. And so you really need to destroy to have another way of influencing people's opinions. And I think only through revolution will you really make enough people realise that actually the planet is really important and we can do something to stop it, and we do need a change of system in order to have that. And you're not going to get that big society change through reform and through capitalism. And that's why we really need, when we're campaigning on the environment, we really do need to be saying, look at all these individual actions. We can do a world of good at the minute, but we need that massive society change in order to actually fix what's happening to the planet.
Hello. Well, Connor said that really well, so I'm not going to repeat that. But I was thinking about the way capitalism destroys biodiversity for profit. I mean, thinking about the fisheries, we have overfishing, pollution, warming water linked to climate change. Because the water is warming, we have ocean acidification, where more and more carbon dioxide is being dissolved into water, which means that shellfish and lobsters and corals are finding it harder and harder to create their calcium carbonate shells, which means that fewer of them will survive. And of course, the corals are nurseries to a quarter of the ocean's fish. So this is obviously a disaster. But there is the real madness about this is the way capitalism runs only for profit. So it doesn't actually matter whether the fish is eaten or not, which is why we have, millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of tons of fish a year that are dumped. They are not eaten. And you think how much, starvation there is in the world. This is one of the insane parts of it. And I suppose there's a couple of little examples. Krill is one good one at the moment. Krill are tiny little shrimp things that live in the North Pacific and the Antarctic, and they are incredibly high in protein and oils, so they are really prized as fish food for salmon in farms. And they are now being marketed as food supplements for human beings as well. And this industry is worth about $300 million a year. But the companies that are investing in it are expecting this to become $700 million a year by about 2022. I mean, this is an enormous business. But this means we're fishing to almost the bottom of the food chain, destroying these krill, which, whales depend on them, and almost every animal between these tiny shrimp and whales as keystone predators rely on these things. But I think it's really important, just to echo Ian's point, that human beings are not always destructive. This is about capitalism and profit, and you just have to think of the traditional methods of hunting tuna in the Mediterranean, where hundreds of boats and hundreds of thousands of people were involved in the industry that because the tuna go to the end of the Mediterranean to breed if they're left to their own devices, and they were able to hunt them in such a way that it did not disturb their breeding patterns. And that is how that industry ran for 2,000 years without being wrecked. It's the post-war industrial capitalism since the Second World War that has destroyed the tuna industry, not what we did before.
I think everybody is agree with the destruction of the capitalisms in environment, nature, and also society. But the question is what we have to do, and if we have to wait until time comes and capitalists collapse, or we have to start from now to do something. I think we shouldn't wait and already start from tomorrow or whatever it is, and to see what we can do to how many steps we can go forward to save the earth. Even small things. So So recently with some family, I went help them in allotment in the garden and things like that. Yeah. So because allotment is not for profit. Yeah. And we decided to have an organic one without any chemical things and things. Really, we find that it's amazing job, one of the best jobs you can do. Work in the earth, with the soil, nature, and things like that, and leave something for the animals as well, not just destroy them. And then I was thinking about our relationship too. I mean, so they wanted to give me some money. They gave they gave some money to me. I said, okay, I'm against the money and things. Let's get rid of this relationship of giving wages, money, and things like that. At the end, so we agreed that. So we are working together, and then I'm very happy in allotment. So without any money and things like that, and we enjoying all the day and the time. It's better than gold for us. Yeah. Anyway, but so I agree. At the end, if we don't go, we stay in that level, and we don't go for get rid of capitalism, so we can't eradicate this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Martin talked about how previous societies had ended up undermining themselves, and you kind of feel that when you look at capitalism, don't you? You see both the potential and the advances and the technology that could be used. There is enough to feed us all. And then you see how it holds us back. It actually throws back society often through the logic of competition and profit that people have brought out. And you see that so much with the question of climate change, which Martin obviously touched on as part of it. And he talked about how fossil fuels became very locked into capitalism from the very beginning, during the Industrial Revolution. It's also interesting to look at what an escalation how fossil fuels became further locked in the post-war period. But what I find really interesting, particularly around questions of agriculture and food production, and one of the things people talk about a lot is the use of pesticides and fertilisers. Most farmers across the world have to use them, and dominated by absolutely massive companies, that Dow, Monsanto, that sell these completely, destructive for the environment, actually quite destructive for us in lots of ways. But you look at where that came out of. You think about during the Second World War, the US government put massive investment into things like the chemical industry, the plastic industries to help the war effort. These were where actually the companies like Dow and Monsanto came from, because it sold them off. It sold these state investments into these companies to private companies at rock bottom prices. It was like this massive injection of capital into them that they're then able to dominate and actually go beyond the US and actually enforce a way of producing food using fertilisers and pesticides on a massive scale that actually, because you're in competition, everyone else has to follow suit and farmers have to buy into. Someone mentioned animal agriculture. It's interesting to look at how this has changed around, for example, poultry production. Before the Second World War, there was probably the average flock size of chickens would be like 70. It's like a backyard industry. Now, the average flock size in poultry industry will be like 30,000 birds, with lots of obviously knock-on effects. Part of which, actually, people touched on like antibiotic use, is the impact on, again, back on us, with things like swine flu and bird flu. But the thing is about these is that there is actually a difference, though, today, isn't there, when we talk about these under capitalism and previous societies, because we're not isolated peasants, are we, working on our own land? Actually, the nature of this, if you like, industrialisation of food production and how we work on the land and agriculture has actually brought together very big concentrations of workers in every industry, whether that's at the industries behind those big companies or in the agricultural industry. It actually links with other issues, particularly around food, for example, in Britain, but also across Europe. Massive reliance on migrant labour. We're the people saying people should be able free to move, but actually we say migrants are part of our class and refugees are part of our class, and if they're working in industry, they want to be part of our unions. And why I say this is because it gives us a potential power when people say, what do we do about all these things? Actually, it gives a potential power when people are concentrated, produce them together, creating the profits that are being made, to actually stop production, stop profits, and transform that. And that's quite important if we're talking about winning battles now around health and safety, better conditions at work, better food for us all those questions that we want to control around the environment and agriculture, but also for the bigger transformation of society as well.
Just before you start, you're next. There's a guy with a blue shirt that had his hand up, yeah?
Okay. It's interesting, you're just talking about Monsanto. I don't know how much people know about them in here. One of the things I find really interesting about them is, and one of the biggest crops that's sold anywhere in the world is soya now. It's one of the most massive crops used inside loads of things, highly GM crop. But even worse about that is, if a farm next door to you grows their soybean crop and their seed blows onto your farm, they then own your seed. It is now illegal in the US, and it has been for a few years now. It's illegal to keep your own seed and replant them if they say their seed germinated with yours. So they then own your crop. So even farmers who want to be individual and who want to try and stay somehow out of the system are co-opted into it by laws from the government which say actually now they own you. So if you don't buy the crop from them, next year lawyers come to your house and they sue them. And people have lost their farms over this. The people that tried to fight it, Monsanto can afford millions and millions of dollars to keep people in litigation for years and years until the people lose their farms. It's interesting that we talked about chicken farming as well. One of the big myths about chicken farming is that these independent farmers make a lot of money. Actually, most of them are in debt because every single year they bring out a new regulation which says you need to change the barn, so you need this new type of air conditioning system, or you need this new drug for your chicken. So actually the farmers are getting less and less power, and they're actually angry. You know, I think it's hard to tap into it because they've been pushed so that far down and so far to the back of their own production that they actually have no control over it anymore. Big companies come in and say, we have your farm, we control it, and we own it now. You know, so what we had before was farmers we could go to and maybe try and use them, you know, as a way to push back against these companies. But now they actually have no say anymore. The company owns them, you know, and if they push back against them, the company is like, well, you owe me $100,000 for that new barn that I built. I own your farm. So it's a really difficult thing to do now. Julie said it really well. The way to get is to the workers. Sorry, Amy, sorry. I knew it when I said it. Sorry, Amy. Said it really well. The only way is to get to the workers on those farms, you know what I mean, and stop the production. Because if they can't make the money off that farm and it becomes unprofitable, then they will take notice. And that's what it takes. And I'll come back on the guy's point. He mentioned about eating less meat and how meat production is one of the biggest polluters in society, you know, in capitalist society. And actually that's so true. And actually what it comes down to is to get a socialist world, to get communism to work, it's not just going to take a revolution that comes out of nothing. It will take a complete shift of how people think. Not just about what they want in society, but the food that they eat, how they relate to the people next to them, and how they feel about society in general. You know, this mass needing to have hundreds of stacks of meat on the shelf and eat steak every day, people will change the way that they feel about what they need. They will choose what's healthy for their body, but also what's good for the environment. It won't come just spring out of nothing. So these things will come along with it. They will be fought through and struggle. We'll say, what do we need on the farms? You know, no longer are we going to eat, you know, as much beef or any meat, you know, if that's what is destroying the planet. And it will take those sort of arguments and those sort of struggles that come through with the revolution to change everything. And then the farms will not do the things that, you know, are polluting the environment at this time.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of following on from that point. So apologies if something has been said while I say it. But yeah, basically in the sense of, your question about animal agriculture, because something I've always been very concerned about. And I actually grew up around farming in rural Australia, and that basically it's in, you know, the way, just an example for you of the way the aim of profit changes the way people think. So animals become a commodity. Like I grew up near a dairy farm and also a family who had a free range egg farm. And actually, like, the practices were cruel and awful, but it wasn't because, you know, these people, that they wanted to do that. Like the dairy farm, they had, you know, the cows on the machines all day. And actually, that was because it was, you know, a cheaper way to do things. You know, they had cheaper feed. They inject, I remember seeing families put hormones into the food for chickens. These are the kind of things because they want, you know, trying to make profit, trying to start a business. And actually, and so you see there, like, you know, the way, if we had a different way of thinking about things where profit wasn't the goal, as people have already said, actually that would change the way people think about food and about how they organize food. And like you look back to, for example, to like Russia 1917 when they had like communal kitchens and a whole different way of like organizing things that actually makes you think differently about the production of food and how you go about things. But yeah, and just on the climate stuff as well, obviously this is just a different point, but in the sense of fighting for building on the struggles, in these my stepdad is involved in, I've already said the story before, but involved in a struggle he works in the mines in Australia, and they're going to close down the mines. And he is thinking that I'm going to be against his struggle because, I want the mines to close down because I care about the planet, which I really do, care about the climate. But at the same time, I would support a strike. And it's not saying that we'd want, people who work in the mines to go without work. Actually, I think those jobs could be turned into climate jobs. And I had this argument with him. And I think it's in these kind of struggles that we can really, supporting these struggles and building on those, that we can, build these struggles and actually fight for that different kind of society where we don't have these awful industries and stuff like that.
Hi, my name's Michael. Just want to say something about how we relate to people who are fighting climate change. So I'm active in the Socialist Workers Party in Leicester and Stand Up to Racism. Leicester Stand Up to Racism group was invited to a local climate change conference in Leicester. It was called Climate Change, Migration and Refugees. And then we were invited because we were involved with the Green Party and Greenpeace and so on, those people who were out in February and March protesting against Trump. We made links with them around that. And then in May, around the election, where we did Saturday campaigning with the Green Party, people from Friends of the Earth, War on Want. And Friends of the Earth, War on Want and Leicester City Council set up this Climate Change and Migration Refugee Conference, 6 keynote speakers. Around about 80, 90 local people turns up to this conference, and we have a stall there. And it was interesting how some of the arguments were put forward, because by being there, we can engage. I think Stand Up to Racism's got something to say about migration and refugees and all the racism, but also the history around migration as well. And a lot of the contributions there were 6 keynote speakers. One of them was talking about the migration from Somalia and Eritrea and why people have to cross the Mediterranean, come to Europe, due to climate change. It's also due to war and other factors as well. And so that was good. And another contribution was made by a PhD student who spoke for 20 minutes on the crisis in Nigeria and around the Niger Delta, where fossil fuel companies are ripping the delta to pieces, obviously contributing to climate change and CO2 and all the rest of it, and wrecking that relationship that local people in the Niger Delta have with their local environment, which is very, very much a water environment. Now, interesting, one of the arguments that came up from the floor, once he stopped criticising the system, was the idea of degrowth, that the way the way forward in Nigeria is to actually downsize capitalism, to downsize it, to regulate it. Now, I mean, us from our side, putting up an argument that actually we can't degrowth capitalism, we can't downsize capitalism. Because capitalism is a global system based on competition. Another solution put forward by another speaker, I was speaking on Nicaragua, was about Nicaragua's actually voluntarily didn't sign up to the climate change agreement because it's already reducing CO2 emissions in the country. Therefore, it didn't have to sign up to the treaty. And so if we had more Nicaraguas, then surely we'd have less climate change, less CO2 in the atmosphere. And our argument to that was actually that argument of degrowth and voluntarism, what that misses out is that the system is both global in politically and economically, but it's also global in another sense, that it's actually ripped humankind from the environment. And that's stop there, sorry.
Sorry, there were more people who wanted to speak, but this is going to be our last contribution because we have to finish by 1:45.
Okay, so my apologies on their behalf. Thanks everyone for your great contributions already. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Martin made regarding the interaction of human beings and our environment, and how in our labour, we act upon it and it changes, but it also changes us. And the other point regarding the idea that we're not innately destructive as a species. I would utterly agree with both of those points. Let's just imagine what it was like as we were forced from the land, as the commons were taken. Imagine the turmoil, the suffering. Imagine what it was like when we were forced into the mills in this country, and are now being forced into urban areas all over the world, into similar situations like in China and India. Those people didn't go into those places voluntarily. That wasn't out of some sort of innate desire to work in factories or work in heavy industry, poisonous, extractive industries. And it creates, over a long period, a long process of normalisation. And it's that normalisation, all the myths and propaganda surrounding it, that have enabled the idea of us being the cancer of the earth to develop. Reject it. Reject the normalisation of this industrial development. When I go to PNR, Preston New Road, near Blackpool, where the fracking site is, and they're about to drill imminently, the rig's due soon. It's very upsetting to think about. When I go there and I look over to this fenced compound, I can feel it in myself. You know, I look and I see and I think, it's just another industrial development. Reject it. That is fracking, amongst many other things, is a spear point. The fossil fuel industry, the ruling class, which wants to drive home for a future dominated by them and their industry, and it will lead to extreme environmental destruction that we have already begun. We're already well into a sixth mass extinction, and if we leave it to them, it's just only going to get worse. And we need a revolution. Thank you.
Okay, and Martin's just going to sum up for us now.
Okay, there's a lot to sum up to. But I actually wanted to start where the last speaker did, by re-emphasising that central point of Marx's understanding what nature is and how it relates to us, because I think it's very easy to lose sight of this. There's a famous quote from Engels where he writes that we may by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside, but we are with flesh, blood and brain belonging to it and exist in its midst, and that all our mastery of it consists in the fact that we have the advantage over all other creatures of being able to learn its laws and apply them. I think it's really important that we don't forget that we are part and parcel of nature, because when sometimes you get the approach around the question of the environment and defending nature and protecting it, it's a sort of imaginary return and dream of this pristine vision of nature unaffected by humans. I mean, that's not true. I mean, there's no aspect of nature in Britain which hasn't been impacted upon humans at all in the past. And the idea that we can return to that sort of golden age before humans is completely imaginary. That tree out there, I'm sure the ecologists will correct me, I think it's a sycamore, Acer Pusudio plantatus, I think it is, isn't it? It was imported to Britain. It was imported to Britain by the Tudors because they wanted it for a particular type of wood. It's not natural to Britain, and there's systematic numbers of things. Hares and rabbits imported by the Normans who wanted to use them as food for the rich. The fact that deforestation of Britain wasn't done by chainsaws; it was done by people with hand axes in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. You know, the nature we have today is the result of a process of human development and agency of acting upon the natural world, and crucially, the result of class struggle. You see, someone mentioned allotments. Allotments are fascinating. People often think of allotments as a thing we have because, you know, we like to... When was the peak in allotment creation in Britain? 1832, the Allotment Act. Why 1832? Because in 1831, the Captain Swing riots set fire to Britain, the length and breadth of it, as people, workers, fought for better wages, better conditions from the farmers, sick to death of the poverty, of the underemployment and the unemployment. So the government thought, bloody hell, let's give them some allotments so they can grow their own food and they aren't as hungry. So do you see you know, what we see as a thing that we have to go out on a Sunday or whenever and grow some carrots and have a nice time with the bees. Actually, it's something we have won as a part of us trying to control and maintain our relationship to the world. And I want to come back. Somebody asked about transition towns, and it's in this context I want to respond to it. You see, we as revolutionary socialists are always in favour of fighting for reforms. I want more wind farms and less fracking. in terms of environment. Absolutely, let's be clear. I want no tar sands, you know, all the rest of it, all the other reforms, right? But actually, some reforms rely on the basis that actually capitalism can do it. Transition towns effectively is like saying, let's have a bubble of space where actually our town is zero carbon or low carbon and bugger the rest of you. Well, actually, the environment don't work like that, but also it's not enough. It's not enough. We have there's a very good chapter to promote Ian Angus, who's launching his new book. Very good chapter in his book where he talks about the danger of us ducking the issue of what capitalism is actually doing to the environment. And building a transition town isn't enough. Now, we don't go to those people and say, you fools, you know not what you do. We go to those people and say, actually, it's really great that you're doing this and you're trying to take control of the city and take it away from the bureaucrats and the planners and the capitalists. But actually, we need more than that. Let's build a movement that can fight. Will you come with us to protest against the fracking lorries? Will you come with us on the demonstration for a better climate action? That's I think, the relationship we have with them. But I think we also have to be honest with people that, recycling bottles, we should do it, but it ain't going to be enough, and we need much more than that. And there's a couple of other quick points as well. A couple of minutes left. I'd love to talk at length about agriculture, and I would urge the comrade perhaps to try and maybe there's an article I wrote in International Socialism a couple of years or so about agriculture and capitalism and climate change, and please read that. But I think the thing I would say about agriculture, as every people have suggested, is that capitalist agriculture is shaped not by the desire to feed people, not by the desire to relate to the environment in a nice way or a sustainable way. It's capitalist agriculture exists in terms of making profits for big corporations. That's how it's been shaped. And not even actually the farmers. You see, most farmers in Britain are the unwilling tools of the big corporations up and downstream of the production process who shape how they work, what they grow, when they grow it, what type of animals, what type of pesticides, what type of seeds and so on. Have very little say. Most of those farmers, if you read Farmers Weekly, as I frequently do, bizarrely enough, you actually find they want to do things better. They want a better sustainable. They don't want the horrible conditions the pigs and cows are in. They want to grow farms without pesticide. Actually, they can't within the context. It's very difficult to it. And I think we have to find ways of making that. Rachel Carson, people mentioned the pesticides and so on. Rachel Carson wrote in her wonderful book, Silent Spring, over 50 years ago now, that the problem is that agriculture and pesticides are in the context of an era in which the right to make a dollar at whatever cost is seldom challenged. And that's the problem. We have to challenge that sense of it's right, the pure right to make profits and the rest of it. Land ownership. Somebody mentioned the really important question of land ownership. You see, I agree. We should nationalise the land, one of the first acts of the revolution, just as interestingly enough, it was when 100 years ago in the Russian Revolution, was to say the state owns the land and the people who use it and work on it should carve it and use it as they want. It won't quite happen in the same way in Britain, I don't think, but they should nationalise the land. But we should be honest as well. It's not just land ownership. Nationalising land won't solve the environmental impact. There's a lovely statistic, terrifying statistic. 90 companies are responsible, 90 multinationals are responsible for 63% of worldwide global emissions since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. That 90 companies, 63%. It's a terrifying figure. But actually, 31% of those companies are state-owned. State ownership doesn't just mean that you're going to be somehow miraculously good for the environment and for people. Actually, what we want is state ownership, but we want democratic ownership and control, both of the corporations, but also their relationship to nature, how they use and employ people, how they use the natural world and resources, why they do it, and when they do it. And let's this point, I'm going to return, of course, to Karl Marx, because people, often wrongly say that Marx had very little to say on the environment, and Marx actually had a great deal to say on the environment. But often what he didn't do is to parcel it up into just the environment. He put it as part and parcel of a critique of capitalism and wider society and the rest of it. And let's come back to it's floral old language, but this is Marx's vision of a future sustainable world. Freedom in this field can only consist in socialised man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control instead of being ruled by it as by the blind forces of nature, and achieving this with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favourable and worthy of their human nature. But then, nonetheless, it still remains a realm of necessity. Beyond it begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only when this realm of necessity as its basis. In other words, we want a world which we manage and control our relationship with nature, how we interact with nature, how we change and use it. We don't do that simply because we want it more sustainable, but that's the only way that we can get to the true freedom which will break us free of the limitations of capitalism and class society and allow us to fully express ourselves in a world that is sustainable and will survive for future generations. And I think that's the struggle that Marx fought for, and that's the struggle we in his tradition today will fight for in the future.